In the fearful climate of the Red Scare, Walt Disney was more than just a filmmaker. He was a political force. The story of his testimony in Washington reveals how a long-held grudge would lead him to name names, ruining the careers of the very men who had once helped him build his dream. He had built a star, a studio, a dream, and in a single, brutal meeting, it was all stolen from him. To understand how Walt Disney built a global empire that would change the world, you must first understand how he lost everything and the painful lesson that would forge his iron will and define his entire life. The Boy from Marceline. Before he built a magic kingdom, Walt Disney was a young boy from the American heartland, sketching patriotic cartoons in his school paper. It was here, in the quiet town of Marceline, Missouri, that a dream of a perfect world first took root, a dream that would soon be interrupted by the distant drums of war. Born in Chicago in 1901, Walter Elias Disney experienced an upbringing that was quintessentially American, yet marked by a constant sense of motion. When he was 4 years old, his family moved to a farm in Marceline, a place that would forever imprint itself upon his soul. It was a town of horse-drawn buggies, neighborly parades, and a bustling main street that represented the very best of small-town life. This idealized vision of his youth would one day become the blueprint for the entrance to his own fairy tale kingdom, a nostalgic welcome to a world of his own making. But this idyllic period was fleeting. By the time Walt was a teenager, his family had uprooted twice more, moving first to Kansas City and then back to Chicago. This restless childhood, filled with impermanence, seemed to instill in him a deep-seated longing for a world that was stable, orderly, and entirely within his control. In Chicago, as the Great War raged across the ocean, a young Walt discovered his voice not in words, but in pictures. As the cartoonist for his high school newspaper, he drew images of patriotism and valor, channeling the spirit of the times into his art. But for a boy with such an indomitable will, the sidelines were not enough. In 1918, though he was not yet of age to enlist in the military, he felt a profound calling to serve. With a touch of the characteristic boldness that would define his life, he carefully altered the date on his birth certificate and successfully applied to join the American Red Cross. He was sent to France as an ambulance driver, trading his sketchbook for a steering wheel on the scarred landscapes of a post-war Europe. The young man who had grown up dreaming of a perfect American town was now witnessing the sobering reality of a world picking up the pieces. This experience, at such a formative age, solidified the fierce determination and patriotism that had been budding within him. The boy from Marceline had answered the call, proving that his imagination was matched only by his resolve. But that resolve was about to be tested, not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the unforgiving world of business, where his first dreams would crumble to dust. A string of failures. Every great dreamer must face their share of disappointment. For a young Walt Disney returning from France, the path to success was not paved with gold, but with the noble failures of his earliest ventures and a steadfast friendship that would one day help define an empire. Back in Kansas City, the ambitious young artist reconnected with a quiet, brilliantly talented animator named Ub Iwerks. The two shared a vision for the future of animation, and in January of 1920, they pooled their meager resources to open their first business, Iwerks Disney Commercial Artists. They were young, full of passion, but short on the experience needed to attract steady clients. Despite their best efforts, the fledgling company struggled to stay afloat. It was Walt who left first, taking a temporary job to earn money they could put back into their dream. But soon after, Ub followed. Their first attempt had ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, shared understanding that they still had much to learn. Undeterred, Walt's imagination soon landed on a grander idea. he began creating his own short cartoons for a local theater, and their modest success allowed him to launch a far more ambitious enterprise, Laugh O. Graham Studios. He immediately hired his loyal friend Ub Iwerks, along with a small team of other aspiring animators. Together, they were a band of youthful pioneers, working tirelessly to modernize classic fairy tales with their charming, hand-drawn creations. Their crowning achievement was a clever short called Alice's Wonderland, an innovative film that blended a live-action little girl with an animated world. It was a piece of pure, unbridled creativity, a glimpse into the magic that was to come. Yet artistry alone could not pay the bills. By 1923, despite their talent and dedication, Laugh O. Graham Studios had run out of money and was forced into bankruptcy before they could even release their beloved Alice short. The dream, it seemed, had collapsed for a second time. Bankrupt and with no prospects, he made a final gamble, heading west with a single reel of film and a spirit that refused to be broken. Hollywood's last hope. In 1923, with a bankrupt studio behind him and little more than a single reel of film in his suitcase, Walt Disney arrived in Los Angeles. It was a city of dreams, and his was on the verge of collapse, until a pioneering woman in the industry saw a spark of magic that others had missed. He made his way to his uncle's home, where his older brother Roy was recuperating from tuberculosis. With only a few dollars to his name, Walt's future in the motion picture business seemed uncertain at best. He spent his days making the rounds at the studios, trying to find work as a director. But Hollywood was an unforgiving town for an unknown artist from the Midwest. His real hope, the last ember of his ambition, lay in the charming, innovative short he had carried with him from Kansas City, Alice's Wonderland. It was his final bet, a testament to the creative spirit of his failed Laugh O. Graham studio. As fate would have it, there was someone in the industry who was in desperate need of a new idea. Her name was Margaret J. Winkler, a savvy and respected New York film distributor. She had built her reputation on popular cartoons like Felix the Cat, but she was about to lose the rights to her biggest stars and was searching for the next sensation. When she viewed Walt's unique blend of live action and animation, she saw not the product of a failed business, but the spark of something entirely new. She saw potential where everyone else had seen only risk. In October of that year, a telegram arrived that would change the course of animation history. Winkler offered to distribute a series of these Alice comedies, and a contract was signed for 6 short films. With this lifeline, the Disney brothers, Walt and Roy, officially formed the Disney Brothers Studio. Roy, with his sharp mind for business, would manage the finances, while Walt, the tireless dreamer, would oversee the creative vision. Their first order of business was to bring the brilliant Ub Iwerks to California. In 1924, Walt finally persuaded his loyal friend to leave Kansas City and join them. The team was back together, poised for a success that would finally put them on the map. But it was a success that would attract powerful enemies and lead to the greatest heartbreak of Walt's young career: the Lucky Rabbit. With the success of the Alice comedies, Walt Disney was finally a name in Hollywood. But to reach the next level, he and his friend Ub Iwerks needed a new star, a character born not in the real world, but entirely from the tip of an artist's pen. They found him in a charming, long-eared figure named Oswald, a lucky rabbit who would bring them both fame and heartbreak. By 1926, the novelty of the Alice series, with its blend of a live-action girl in a cartoon world, had begun to fade. The distributor, now run by Margaret Winkler's husband, Charles Mintz, was in need of fresh material he could offer to the Titans at Universal Pictures. This presented a perfect opportunity for Walt, who had long yearned to leave behind the complexities of combining live action with animation. His dream was to create stories in a world of pure imagination, a world built entirely with ink and paint. He and his chief animator, the indispensable Ub Iwerks, put their heads together, their creative synergy at its peak. Out of this collaboration, a delightful new character bounded to life. Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. With his round white face, big expressive eyes, and long, floppy black ears, he was a figure of pure, unadulterated charm. He was spirited, a little mischievous, and possessed a personality that shone through in every animated frame. Astute observers might have noticed a striking family resemblance to a certain famous mouse who was yet to come, and for good reason. Oswald was the product of the same brilliant minds, a clear step in the evolution of the signature Disney style. Universal Pictures was thrilled with the character, and a deal was struck. The Oswald cartoons were an immediate sensation. Audiences adored the Lucky Rabbit's playful antics, and the series became the Disney Brothers Studios' most significant success to date. For the first time, Walt was not just a promising newcomer. He was a genuine hit maker, producing one of the most popular cartoon series in the country. He had proven that his small, ambitious studio could compete with the established giants of the animation world. But as he prepared to negotiate his future, he was walking into a trap that would tear his dream apart. The ultimate betrayal. In February of 1928, Walt Disney traveled to New York, confident he held the upper hand in negotiations for his hit character, Oswald. He believed he was going to secure his studio's future. Instead, he would return to California with nothing, having learned the single most painful and valuable lesson of his entire career. He arrived in the bustling city to meet with his distributor, Charles Mintz, with a simple goal: to negotiate a larger fee for producing the wildly popular Oswald cartoons. The series was a sensation, and Walt felt, quite rightly, that his studio deserved a greater share of the profits. He walked into the meeting as a proud creator, but he would soon be reminded that in the world of big business, creativity without ownership was a fragile thing. To his shock, Mintz not only refused his request for a raise, but demanded that Walt take a 20% cut in pay. It was then that the devastating truth was revealed. Through a clause in the original contract, Universal Pictures, not the Disney Brothers studio, owned the intellectual property rights to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. The character that Walt and Ub Iwerks had poured their hearts into was, in the eyes of the law, not theirs at all. Mintz then delivered a final, calculated blow. He informed Walt that if he did not accept the reduced rate, Mintz would simply create his own studio and produce the Oswald series himself. To underscore the point, he revealed that he had already signed away nearly all of Disney's animators, luring them away with promises of continued work. Walt was stunned. The artists he had mentored, the team he considered a family, had abandoned him. With a resolve that belied his heartbreak, he refused Mintz's offer. He would not work under such conditions. He walked away from the deal, and from Oswald, with only one animator still by his side, his loyal, unwavering friend, Ub Iwerks. The betrayal was absolute, a profound wound that would shape every business decision he would make for the rest of his life. Never again would he allow his creations to be owned by another. This vow, born from the loss of control, would become the bedrock of his empire as he set out to create a new hero, one that nobody could ever take away from him. A mouse is born. On the long, lonely train ride home from New York, having lost everything, Walt Disney knew he needed a new idea. It was in this moment of quiet desperation, with the rhythm of the rails as his only companion, that a small, cheerful mouse, first named Mortimer, began to take shape in his mind. As the American landscape rolled by his window, Walt sketched and dreamed, searching for a character who could fill the void left by Oswald. He needed a hero, someone with pluck and optimism who could mirror his own refusal to be defeated. He recalled a tame mouse that used to inhabit his old Laugh-O-Gram studio in Kansas City, a fond memory from a time of youthful struggle. From this recollection, a new figure began to emerge on the page, a spirited little character with round ears and a can-do attitude. Walt decided to name him Mortimer Mouse. He was pleased with the creation, a symbol of a fresh start. But when he presented the idea to his wife, Lillian, she offered a piece of gentle yet transformative advice. Lillian, who had been his steadfast partner through every failure and triumph, felt that the name Mortimer was a bit too grand, perhaps even pompous, for such a humble and endearing little fellow. With the simple, elegant intuition that so often guided their partnership, she suggested another name, something friendlier, warmer, and more relatable. She proposed they call him Mickey. In that single moment, a character was christened and a legend was born. It was a beautiful testament to their relationship. Walt possessed the boundless imagination to create a new world, but it was Lillian who often provided the gentle touch of humanity that made it truly resonate. This new creation was more than just a replacement for the character he had lost. He was a symbol of resilience, a joint effort born from a moment of profound crisis. Mickey Mouse was the product of a husband's dogged determination and a wife's loving insight. A name had been chosen and a glimmer of hope returned. But now this little mouse needed a definitive look, a design that could truly capture the hearts of millions. The unsung genius. While Walt Disney famously gave Mickey Mouse his soul, the man who gave the mouse his iconic look was the brilliant, loyal friend who had stood by him through everything. His name was Ub Iwerks, the quiet genius behind the animation table, and without his hand, the world's most famous character might never have come to be. When Walt returned from New York with his nascent idea for a new hero, he turned to the one person he knew. Ub Iwerks was the sole animator who had refused to abandon him for the promise of security with Charles Mintz. He had chosen loyalty and friendship over a guaranteed paycheck. And now, in a nearly empty studio, the two friends set out to create magic. Walt brought his initial sketches of the mouse to Ub, and what happened next was a display of sheer artistic brilliance. With his legendary speed and draftsman's precision, Ub refined the character's design. He simplified the form, making Mickey rounder and softer, with large, expressive eyes and circular ears that would be recognizable from any angle. This redesign was more than just an aesthetic improvement. It was a stroke of practical genius. Ub's streamlined version was far easier and faster to animate, allowing for the fluid, lively movement that would become a hallmark of the character. In those early days, it was Ub Iwerks who almost single-handedly brought Mickey to life, working at a pace that was nothing short of astonishing. He was a human whirlwind of creativity, capable of producing hundreds of drawings a day, animating entire shorts with a speed and skill that few could ever hope to match. It was a partnership of perfect balance, leading one Disney employee to remark that while Ub designed Mickey's physical appearance, Walt gave him his soul. Walt provided the optimistic personality, the can-do spirit, and for many years, the character's signature falsetto voice. But it was Ub's hand that drew the cheerful the world would soon embrace. Their collaboration, forged in the fires of betrayal, had produced a character for the ages. But in an industry rapidly changing, a picture was no longer enough. This new star needed to make himself heard. The roar of the crowd. A new character was not enough. Mickey Mouse needed to capture the world's imagination. After two silent shorts failed to make a splash, Walt gambled on a revolutionary new technology, sound, to create a cinematic moment that would change animation forever. The first two Mickey Mouse cartoons, Plain Crazy and The Gallopin' Gaucho, were produced in the spring of 1928. While filled with visual charm, they were released into a world enchanted by a new marvel, the talking picture. Both of Mickey's initial outings failed to find a distributor. Undaunted, Walt saw this new technology not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Inspired by the sensation of the jazz singer, he made a bold and incredibly risky decision. He would create a third Mickey short with a fully synchronized soundtrack. The chosen vehicle was Steamboat Willie, a simple tale of Mickey as a mischievous deckhand. The task of perfectly timing the music and sound effects to the on-screen action was monumental. It required painstaking precision, with animators timing their drawings to a metronome's beat. Walt poured every last dollar he had into the project, a final all-or-nothing wager. On November 18, 1928, at the Colony Theater in New York City, the world saw, and more importantly, heard Mickey Mouse for the first time. The reaction was immediate and electric. Audiences were mesmerized, their feet tapping to the jaunty music, their laughter roaring as every whistle and clang on screen was matched with a perfect sound. It was an immersive, joyful experience that pulled them right out of their seats and into the screen. By the end, the theater was filled with thunderous applause. In that moment, a star was born, and Walt Disney had revolutionized an entire art form. But such a massive success would attract a new kind of business partner, one who would put Walt's hard-won control to the test once more. Another shocking betrayal. Success in Hollywood often attracts predators. For Walt Disney, that came in the form of distributor Pat Powers, a man who promised him the world, but delivered only heartache, culminating in a betrayal from the one person Walt thought would never leave his side. In the wake of Steamboat Willie's sensational debut, Walt needed a distributor with the power to place his cartoons in theaters across the country. He found that power in Pat Powers, a former Universal executive who signed the Disney studio to a lucrative new deal. For a time, the partnership flourished. Powers' company brought both the wildly popular Mickey Mouse series and a new experimental collection of shorts called The Silly Symphonies to a national audience. Yet, as the profits rolled in, Walt and his brother Roy began to grow uneasy. The numbers, it seemed, did not quite add up, and they suspected that Powers was not being entirely forthcoming with their rightful share. The situation was a painful echo of the Oswald affair, and it put Walt on constant edge. But a far more personal storm was brewing within the studio walls. Ub Iwerks, the animation prodigy who had been with Walt from the very beginning, was growing weary. He felt his monumental contributions were being overshadowed by Walt's ever-growing fame. He longed for the recognition he felt he deserved. Seeing this rift, Pat Powers made a calculated move. In an act of retaliation against Walt's demands for more money, he approached Ub with a tempting offer: a contract to start and finance his very own animation studio. Torn between loyalty and ambition, and feeling deeply undervalued, Ub made a decision that would stun the animation world. He accepted Powers' offer. For Walt, this was a wound far deeper than any financial dispute. The friend who had stood by him when all others had deserted him was now leaving. This double-barreled betrayal, both professional and personal, would push him to the very edge of his endurance. The breaking point. The loss of his oldest friend and the relentless pressure of his feud with Pat Powers took a tremendous toll. By 1931, the man who brought so much joy to the world had none left for himself, leading to a collapse that would force him to step away from the very empire he had built from scratch. The departure of Ub Iwerks was more than just an emotional blow. It was a creative crisis. Without his star animator, the immense workload of producing the studio's cartoons fell heavily on Walt's shoulders. He was not only the visionary and the voice of his star character, but he was now forced to oversee every detail of an increasingly complex animation pipeline. The constant stress of his financial battles with Powers, combined with the personal sting of betrayal and the crushing weight of his creative responsibilities, became an unbearable burden. In October of that year, the man who had seemed so indomitable finally reached his limit. He suffered a serious nervous breakdown. It was a quiet, private collapse, a moment when the sheer exhaustion of his relentless drive caught up with him. His doctor's orders were unequivocal. He needed a complete and total rest, a true escape from the pressures that had consumed him. Heeding this advice, Walt and his wife Lillian embarked on an extended holiday, a much-needed respite from the Hollywood machine. They traveled to Washington, D.C. to visit the seat of American government, a place that had always inspired him, and then journeyed on to the warm, tranquil shores of Cuba. For the first time in years, Walt was able to simply rest, to walk without the weight of a studio on his back, and to reconnect with the woman who had been his anchor through every storm. This period of healing was transformative. It allowed him to regain his strength, not just physically, but emotionally. He was able to see his life and his work with a new, clearer perspective. When he returned to California, he was not the same man who had left. The breakdown had not broken him. It had fortified him, arming him with a new resolve to finally create the studio he had always envisioned. The Golden Age. Rejuvenated and with a new distribution deal, Walt Disney entered the most creative period of his life. The 1930s saw his studio blossom, introducing the world to a new cast of beloved characters and painting his films in glorious, groundbreaking color. Upon his return to California, Walt was a man transformed. With a clear mind and a fortified spirit, he made the decisive move to sever all ties with the distributor, Pat Powers, finally freeing himself from the contentious partnership. He promptly signed a new agreement with Columbia Pictures, one that gave him far more creative control and a much fairer share of the revenue. With the business side of his studio finally secure, he was free to unleash the full force of his imagination, and a torrent of creativity followed. The world had fallen in love with Mickey Mouse, but Walt knew his star needed a supporting cast of friends. First came Pluto, Mickey's loyal and perpetually perplexed canine companion, who debuted in 1930. Soon after, the studio introduced the world to the lovable, clumsy, and eternally optimistic Goofy. But the trio was not complete until 1934, with the arrival of a certain cantankerous waterfowl with a famously short temper and a heart of gold, Donald Duck. With his unintelligible squawks and fiery personality, Donald was an instant sensation, the perfect comedic foil to Mickey's cheerful heroism. Together, this trio, Mickey, Donald, and Goofy, would become the foundation of the Disney universe, an enduring symbol of friendship and adventure. Yet the innovation was not limited to character. Walt had always been a technological pioneer, and he saw a brilliant future in the emerging marvel of color film. In 1932, while his competitors were still working in black and white, Walt secured exclusive rights to the new, full 3-strip Technicolor process for cartoons. He debuted this breathtaking technology in a silly symphony called Flowers and Trees. Audiences were spellbound by the vibrant, living palette on screen, the lush greens of the leaves, the brilliant reds and yellows of the blossoms. It was a spectacle of pure, enchanting beauty, and it won the studio its very first Academy Award. Walt was now the undisputed leader of a golden age of animation, but his boundless ambition was already looking toward an even greater and far more impossible challenge. Disney's Folly. By 1934, Walt Disney had conquered the world of animated shorts, but his ambition was far greater. He dreamed of something no one had ever dared to attempt, a full-length animated feature film, a project so audacious the industry mockingly dubbed it Disney's Folly. For years, animated cartoons had been seen as little more than charming novelties, short appetizers served before the main cinematic course. The idea that audiences would pay to watch a cartoon for nearly 90 minutes was considered ludicrous. Industry insiders, from powerful studio moguls to seasoned film critics, were unanimous in their prediction. The project would be a financial catastrophe that would destroy the Disney studio. They believed the bright colors would strain the audience's eyes, and that the fantasy of a fairy tale could not possibly sustain a feature-length running time. The whispers in Hollywood were relentless, and the project was dismissed as a flight of fancy from a man who had finally overreached. Even Walt's own family had their doubts. His practical-minded brother Roy and his ever-supportive wife Lillian both tried to talk him out of it, fearing that he was risking everything they had built on an impossible dream. But Walt's vision was absolute. He sought to control the entire cinematic experience, to create a world so immersive it could hold an audience completely captive. One evening, he gathered his top animators on a soundstage and, for the next several hours, personally acted out the entire story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He became every character, from the innocent princess to the wicked queen, describing each scene with such passion and vivid detail that he held his artists completely spellbound. By the end of his performance, he had transformed their skepticism into unbridled enthusiasm. They saw what he saw, a story filled with heart, humor, and genuine suspense. He had inspired them to believe. Against the advice of his family and the scorn of an entire industry, Walt pushed forward with his magnificent obsession. To bring it to life, however, he would need to invent a new kind of magic. Inventing the impossible. To bring his fairy tale to life, Walt Disney knew he needed more than just a good story. He needed to invent a new kind of magic. The answer was a revolutionary piece of technology that would give animation a sense of depth and realism no one had ever seen before, transforming a flat cartoon into a breathtakingly immersive world. Until that time, animated films were fundamentally two-dimensional. Characters moved across a single, static background painting, creating a world that, while charming, lacked the depth of live-action cinematography. For a 90-minute feature, Walt knew he needed to draw the audience into the story. To achieve this, his studio embarked on a daring engineering feat: the creation of the multi-plane camera. It was an intimidating apparatus, standing over 14 feet tall and requiring a team of skilled technicians to operate. Its concept, however, was one of elegant simplicity. Instead of a single background, artists would paint different elements of a scene: foreground trees, a midground cottage, and distant mountains on separate panes of glass. These panes were then carefully placed at various distances within the towering camera structure. The massive camera, positioned at the very top, would photograph down through these layers of artwork. By moving each pane of glass at a slightly different speed, the animators could create a remarkable illusion of depth and motion. The result was a stunning three-dimensional effect. For the first time, when Snow White ran through the forest, audiences ran with her. The camera moved through the trees, creating a sense of panic and depth that pulled viewers directly out of their seats and into the screen. This invention was not merely a technical trick. It was a profound artistic breakthrough. It allowed the filmmakers to compose shots with the same dramatic power as a live-action director, using the environment itself to enhance the story's emotion. The years of tireless work were over, and the time had come to reveal their impossible dream to a skeptical world. The Gift and the Curse. The premiere of Snow White in 1937 was Walt Disney's greatest triumph, the moment his impossible dream became a dazzling reality. Flushed with success, he gave his beloved parents the most wonderful gift he could imagine: a new home. He never dreamed that this beautiful gesture of love would lead to the single greatest tragedy of his life. On the 21st of December, 1937, the Hollywood elite, including luminaries like Clark Gable and Marlene Dietrich, gathered at the Carthay Circle Theater for the world premiere. The industry that had mockingly labeled the film Disney's Folly sat with arms crossed, expecting to witness a spectacular failure. But as the film unfolded, a hush fell over the crowd. Skepticism melted into wonder as the audience was transported. They laughed with the dwarfs, wept for the princess, and gasped at the terrifying queen. By the final frame, the theater erupted in a thunderous, sustained standing ovation. Walt Disney, the man who had risked everything, stood with tears in his eyes. His Folly was a masterpiece. With the immense profits from the film, Walt and his brother Roy finally had the means to provide their parents, Elias and Flora, with the comfortable life they had always dreamed of for them. As a grand gesture of their love and gratitude, they purchased a beautiful new home for them in North Hollywood, a place where they could enjoy their golden years in comfort and security. The home was modern, even featuring a state-of-the-art gas furnace. Almost immediately after moving in, Flora wrote to her sons about a problem with the furnace, and they promptly sent a repairman from their own studio to fix the issue. Tragically, the repair was not done correctly. On November 26, 1938, a housekeeper arrived to find both Elias and Flora unconscious. They were rushed from the house, but it was too late for Flora. While Elias would eventually recover, Walt's beloved mother succumbed to the inhalation of carbon monoxide fumes. The gift, born of love and success, had become an unthinkable curse. For the rest of his days, Walt was haunted by the tragic irony, a private grief that would cast a long shadow over all the public triumphs still to come. A stain on the crown. In the afterglow of Snow White's success, the world saw Walt Disney as a king, but a king must hold court. And in 1938, a deeply controversial decision to host a Nazi propagandist at his studio would leave a permanent stain on his immaculate reputation. As Europe edged closer to the brink of war, a brilliant and fiercely controversial German filmmaker named Leni Riefenstahl arrived in Hollywood. She was celebrated for her groundbreaking cinematic techniques, but she was also infamous as the creator of powerful propaganda films for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Her visit came in December, just 1 month after the horrific wave of anti-Jewish violence in Germany, known as Kristallnacht. Hollywood, which had a large and influential Jewish community, was outraged by her presence. Studio after studio shut their gates, refusing to meet with a woman so closely associated with such a hateful regime. Yet, to the shock and disappointment of many, one studio left its door open. Walt Disney, perhaps seeing Riefenstahl solely through the lens of a fellow film innovator, granted her a personal tour of his studio lot. The decision was, and remains, one of the most debated actions of his life. It is a moment that is difficult to fully understand. From a modern perspective, most historians believe Walt's motivations were not rooted in any sympathy for her politics, but rather in a combination of factors. It could have been a certain political naivete, a professional courtesy extended to a filmmaker whose artistry he may have admired, or even a pragmatic business decision, hoping the visit might help lift the ban on his films in Germany. Whatever the reason, the damage was immediate and lasting. The image of Walt Disney welcoming a key figure of the Nazi regime, especially at such a tense and painful moment in world history, created a blemish on his reputation that would never fully fade. It was a complex and unfortunate chapter, a moment when the master of fantasy perhaps failed to grasp the grim realities of the world outside his studio gates, a world that was about to bring war right to his doorstep. War in the Magic Kingdom. While the world outside was heading toward war, a different kind of battle was brewing inside the walls of the Disney studio. The artists who had helped build the dream were now demanding their fair share, leading to a bitter strike that would wound Walt Disney to his very core. The dawn of the 1940s brought a period of financial strain for the studio. The magnificent follow-ups to Snow White, the artistically brilliant Pinocchio, and the revolutionary Fantasia had failed to find the same box office success. With the war in Europe closing off valuable overseas markets, the studio's profits dwindled. This led to layoffs, pay cuts, and broken promises of bonuses, fostering a growing sense of discontent among the animators. At the same time, a powerful union movement was sweeping through Hollywood, and the artists at Disney wanted the same protections and fair wages as their colleagues at other studios. To Walt, however, this was not a simple labor issue. It was a profound, personal betrayal. He had always viewed his studio as a kind of family, an art school, where he was the benevolent patriarch, guiding his talented boys. The idea of an outside union interfering in his carefully constructed world was anathema to him. He could not understand why his artists felt the need for such representation when, in his eyes, he had given them everything. The simmering tensions finally boiled over in the spring of 1941. When Walt dismissed a key union organizer, the brilliant animator Art Babbitt, hundreds of his employees walked out. The cheerful, bustling studio on Hyperion Avenue was suddenly surrounded by picket lines, with artists carrying signs that depicted their beloved characters in revolt. It was a jarring spectacle, a civil war in the heart of the Magic Kingdom. The strike lasted for 5 bitter weeks, dividing the studio and creating wounds that would never fully heal. It was eventually settled through federal mediation, largely in favor of the union. While many animators returned to their drawing boards, the family atmosphere was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of mistrust. For Walt, the strike was more than a business dispute. It was the end of an era of innocence, and the grudge he carried from it would soon find a national stage. The Red Scare. The wounds from the 1941 strike never fully healed. Years later, haunted by what he saw as a communist plot to undermine his studio, Walt Disney would take the stand in Washington, D.C., and name names forever cementing his place in the controversial history of the Hollywood blacklist. In the years following the Second World War, a palpable fear of communism swept across America, and Hollywood became one of its primary targets. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, began a series of high-profile investigations, convinced that subversive elements were embedding themselves in the nation's film industry. It was a time of suspicion, accusation, and deeply divided loyalties. For Walt Disney, who had come to see the earlier Union movement as an attack on both his company and his country, this was a cause he felt compelled to join. In 1946, he became a founding member of a group called the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization committed to defending Hollywood from what it saw as the threat of communism. A year later, in 1947, Walt traveled to the nation's capital to testify before the committee as a friendly witness. He sat before the panel of congressmen and spoke of his conviction that the bitter strike that had crippled his studio 6 years earlier was not a simple labor dispute. In his view, it had been an orchestrated, communist-led effort to gain a foothold in his organization. Then, under oath, he named 3 of his former animators, men who had been key organizers of the strike, and identified them as potential communist agitators. It was a stunning and deeply consequential accusation. The impact of his testimony was devastating for the men he named. In the fearful climate of the Red Scare, such an allegation was a professional death sentence. They were promptly blacklisted, their careers in the animation industry effectively over. They were unable to find work in the town they had helped build, their contributions to the art form erased by suspicion. It remains one of the darkest chapters of Walt's life. After decades of betrayal and conflict, Walt decided that if he couldn't find a perfect world in Hollywood, he would have to build one himself. A kingdom of his own. Disenchanted with the conflicts of filmmaking, Walt Disney turned his sights to a new, grander vision. He dreamed of a place where families could escape the troubles of the world and step directly into a storybook, a clean, happy, and perfect kingdom of his own making. For years, Walt had harbored a dream that went far beyond the silver screen. He had watched families visit amusement parks and noted how the children would ride the carousels while the parents sat on benches with little to do. He envisioned a new kind of park, a place that was meticulously clean, safe, and designed for the enjoyment of the entire family. His inspiration was solidified during a trip to Europe, where he visited the charming Tivoli Gardens in Denmark. He was captivated by its festive, orderly atmosphere and the sight of generations of families laughing and creating memories together. It was then that his vague idea crystallized into a clear and passionate mission. In 1952, he purchased a 160-acre orange grove in the quiet, then rural town of Anaheim. To bring his incredible vision to life, he assembled a special team of animators, architects, and engineers, a group he affectionately dubbed his Imagineers. This was not to be a simple collection of rides. It was the ultimate expression of his lifelong need for a world he could control. At the heart of it all was Main Street, USA, a deeply personal and nostalgic recreation of the idyllic Main Street from his own childhood in Marceline, Missouri. It was, in essence, the perfect American town he had held in his heart for his entire life. On July 17, 1955, Disneyland opened its gates. The opening ceremony was broadcast live on the ABC television network, and an astonishing 70 million viewers tuned in to watch the dream become a reality. Despite a chaotic opening day, the American public was utterly enchanted. Walt Disney had created something entirely new under the sun. Yet, even with this monumental achievement complete, there was still one last cinematic promise he was determined to keep. A spoonful of sugar. There was one story Walt Disney had chased for over 20 years, a promise he had made to his own daughters. But to bring the magical nanny Mary Poppins to the screen, he would first have to win over her fiercely protective and famously difficult creator, P.L. Travers. The journey began in the early 1940s, when Walt's daughters, Diane and Sharon, fell in love with the enchanting books about a mysterious nanny who arrives on the east wind. They adored the stories of Mary Poppins and her magical adventures on Cherry Tree Lane, and they pleaded with their father to turn their favorite book into a motion picture. Walt, a devoted family man, promised them that he would. It was a promise that would prove far more difficult to keep than he could have ever imagined. The author, a woman named Pamela Lyndon Travers, was deeply attached to her creation and had absolutely no desire to see her stern, sensible, and wonderfully vain nanny receive what she feared would be a sentimental Hollywood treatment. For the next 2 decades, Walt pursued the film rights with a gentle but relentless determination. He wrote letters, he made phone calls from across the Atlantic, and he used all of his legendary charm to try and convince the skeptical author that he would honor her work. Travers rebuffed him at every turn. Finally, in 1961, with her book sales dwindling, she reluctantly agreed to travel to Hollywood and consult on the film, though she insisted on having final script approval. What followed was a legendary clash of 2 powerful creative wills. The optimistic, cheerful Walt and the stern, uncompromising Travers disagreed on nearly everything, from the casting of the main characters to the very heart of the story. She particularly objected to the film's catchy songs, and most of all, to his plan to include a sequence of delightful animation. Somehow, through sheer persistence and a genuine belief in the magic of the story, Walt managed to navigate the turbulent collaboration. He kept his promise to his daughters. The resulting film, Mary Poppins, premiered in 1964 to worldwide acclaim. It was a dazzling masterpiece and a crowning achievement for Walt, but it would also be his final, triumphant cinematic statement. The final curtain. Walt Disney was a man who never stopped dreaming, working on new projects and imagining future worlds right up until his final days. Though his life was cut short by illness, he left behind a legacy of magic that is altogether undeniable, even if the man himself remains far more human and far more complex than the myths suggest. Like many men of his generation, Walt was a lifelong smoker, a habit that eventually caught up with him. In early November of 1966, following a period of declining health, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. He was a creator to the very end, and even from his hospital bed, his mind was still brimming with ideas for the future, particularly his ambitious vision for a utopian city in the wetlands of Florida. But his time was running out. On December 15, 1966, just 10 days after his 65th birthday, Walter Elias Disney passed away. The news stunned the world. The man who had seemed like an eternal, optimistic presence in American life was gone. His legacy, however, was immortal. In his remarkable lifetime, he had played a role in 81 feature films. He received an astonishing 59 Academy Award nominations and won 22, both records that still stand to this day. His success is undeniable, yet his reputation remains a subject of endless fascination and debate. He was a beloved visionary who brought unparalleled joy to millions, but he was also a demanding and sometimes ruthless businessman who held deep grudges. He was a patriot who celebrated the ideals of his country, but who also participated in the painful divisions of the Hollywood blacklist. He was, in the end, a wonderfully complicated figure. A man as complex as the century he helped to shape. Whether you see him as the ultimate American icon or a flawed symbol of his time, one truth is undeniable. Walt Disney created magic that will live on long after all of us. The boy from Marceline, who sketched cartoons in a scrapbook and dreamed of a better, more beautiful world, had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination. He built a kingdom not of brick and stone, but of hope, wonder, and the enduring power of a story well told, reminding us all that it all started with a dream and a mouse. The magic he created is undeniable, but the story of the man behind it is one of heartbreak, betrayal, and relentless ambition. If you enjoyed this journey into the life of a true Hollywood legend, please show your support with a like. Be sure to subscribe for more untold stories from the Golden Age.